So welcome, everyone. This is the National Hispanic Health Foundation. We are the foundation started by NHMA, or the National Hispanic Medical Association. We're the 501c3 arm that allows partners from the corporate sector to give us funding, and especially foundations. We started that foundation really to be able to have a way to receive money that we could give away. We wanted to be able to develop scholarships, and we have since 2004. But tonight we're here because we want to give away information on advancing careers for research. And one of the most important themes that has come up in healthcare policy in Washington, D.C. has been the importance of FDA mandating that all clinical trials have to have diversity. And the diversity means having more Latinos or African Americans, Native Americans, those who have been underrepresented in medicine, to be principal investigators, to be in charge of their research, so that we can get more documentation planned by researchers who come from our communities. We've also seen the importance of diversity among the patients. And in order to get more Latino patients for diversity in clinical trials, we need to have more recruitment efforts that are planned and designed by Latino researchers. Whether they're doctors or nurses doesn't matter. But in our case, with the National Hispanic Health Foundation, we decided to focus on doctors and the careers that doctors should think about as they move on in their from residency to their first step in their careers, to their mid-careers, to think about how they could add in research into their career. And the last thing I'm going to say, just as a little by way of introduction, then we'll go to the housekeeping slide, is that we have two experts here who have been in clinical trials, who started their own clinical trial programs within their own private medical practices. And I have to say, for those of you that don't recognize this, the majority of Latino doctors go into private practice. We have very few that go into academics as faculty teaching, but even those who go into faculty level jobs also go into some research. But it's the private practice doctors that we're trying to find who might have an interest in learning that they could do research, what we call clinical research. And if they don't do the research themselves as a private principal investigator, as our doctors here tonight do, they could enroll their patients into clinical trials and refer them. And we, as a national organization, have decided that we are starting what we call the National Center for Hispanic Health Research to be able to develop more diversity in research. And so we're going to start tonight with this clinical trial project and the Latino physicians in practice conducting clinical trials and lessons learned from them. And with us tonight are two doctors that I will introduce in a minute. I want to go to the next slide, Letty, and I want to thank Letty, our staff person, our manager at NHHF. So we have just a minute of housekeeping. We want everybody to keep their microphones muted. Please use the raised hand function at the end if you are interested in asking a question, or just put the questions in the Q&A box. We are going to have our speakers talk first, and then we'll have 20 minutes or so or longer at the end for questions. The recording will be housed on our nhmafoundation.org, that's our website, and our YouTube channel in about a week, the recording and slides. And we are going to have a special questionnaire because we're interested in, again, not only having more discussion tonight, but focusing on developing a mentoring program that will be related to clinical trial diversity between doctors who have experience in clinical trials, who could be mentors, and those doctors who are young doctors, or let's say doctors in their mid-careers, or even residents who are interested in learning how to do clinical trials. So that's why we really need the survey done. And that will be sent to all the participants after the session. The other thing I want to say is I want to thank the sponsors, and the two major sponsors for this webinar is Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer. And we've had some other sponsors who are very interested in helping us, and we invite sponsors to consider working with us as we move on this journey to find more Latinos to get into clinical trials. Next slide. So our first speaker is Dr. Joe Martel, Assistant Dean of Graduate Medical Education and Chair of the Department of Ophthalmology at California North State College of Medicine. And Joe, if you can also tell us all your titles with your practice, but he has been in private practice and developing these clinical trials program through that. And also I just want to thank you for the solokiko.org website there, and reminds me of the importance of letting everybody know that we partner with Dr. Martel on another project that we're funded to do on vaccination education. And the solokiko.org is, I'm going to say, targeted to young people in grammar school, bilingual books and videos to tell their families about the importance of vaccinations and the importance of COVID-19. Joe?
Thank you so much, Elena. I really appreciate it. Obviously, I also, like with Dr. Rios, is very interested in trying to encourage Hispanic and all minority physicians to participate in research. I think probably one of the biggest myths and one of the biggest barriers to physicians, there are both barriers in terms of our patients as well as physicians in terms of improving the diversity of these clinical trials. I have been in clinical trials for about 20 years, and gradually over time, the diversity is definitely improving within these clinical trials. And I'll go through some of the importance of why it is that physicians that are minority should get into these studies. First, let me encourage everybody to really consider getting involved in these. I think one of the biggest barriers and misconceptions is the fact that people think that most of these clinical trials and most of the patients involved occur within universities. But let me assure you that there are many, many advantages to having clinical trials conducted outside of the academic environment. Now, clearly, there are some that are designed for in academic environment, but a lot of the regular clinical trials are conducted in practices like mine. And I do work at a university, but on the other hand, I also work in my own practice, and my clinical studies are primarily within my primary practice or my private practice. And you'll find that pharmaceutical companies strongly encourage this, because for them, not only is it easier to work within the framework of a private practice, because it keeps the paperwork down, but it's infinitely more economic to run these studies with a very high grade of quality within the practices of regular physicians like myself and a lot of the Hispanic and other minority physicians. And obviously, we know that most of minority physicians wind up in primary practice and in some of the primary care specialties. And this is where I think we could make a significant improvement in the way these clinical trials are conducted. Let me have the next slide. And again, my first question is to ask yourself, why obviously is it important for the Latinx population to participate in clinical trials? And the obvious reason is because not only do we represent a unique environment or a unique population that is susceptible to certain types of diseases, but we're also growing at a much faster rate than any other portion of the population. To give you an example, between 2000 and 2006, the Hispanic population, well, even in the last year, the Hispanic population grew almost 23% as compared to about 7% for the general population. So our population is growing at a much faster rate. And so we continue to become a larger portion of the healthcare within the country. Next slide. So Hispanics will continue to become a larger consumer of the healthcare, and this is one of the reasons why it's important for us to continue to participate. Okay, can I have the next slide? Okay, to give you an idea though how underrepresented we typically are in a lot of these clinical trials, this is one of the more interesting slides that I have to offer to you. This is a medication that was approved by the FDA for the treatment of diabetes. And if you take a look at the makeup, obviously you see that the vast majority of the clinical population or the study population is white. If you take a look at the Hispanic population included, you'll see that we're not even listed, because we're listed under other, because we're that small of a portion of the population, including in the study. Now, obviously, on something like diabetes, where Hispanics have literally twice the incidence of diabetes as the general population, these medications become very important, and being included in them, will allow the drug manufacturers to continue to make better and more accurately responsive medications, for all communities. If you take a look at this type of study analysis, we can make a strong argument that it doesn't really represent our community. And so, yes, the medications, we continue to use them, but when it comes to complications and adverse events, this is, this type of a study is not going to be adequate. Next slide. So why are clinical trials so important? Let me go through some of them. We can go to the next slide. If you take a look at the medications, obviously it doesn't take a genius to recognize that medications will obviously work different within different groups of people, particularly because certain races and certain groups of people are more susceptible to certain types of diseases. Diabetes continues to be one of the ones that I'll harp on, because obviously that's an illness that's affected not just by the incidence, but also by the diet that we consume, by the environment that we lived in, the socioeconomic factors. But just within the medication alone, if you take a look at the studies between 2008 and 2013, the FDA did a study to see if there were differences within different populations within the studies, and then they found that approximately 20%, or 1 in 5 of the medications approved, responded differently within different groups. And again, this harps back to, if you have studies where diabetes isn't, doesn't include Hispanics, obviously this is not going to be adequate. So clearly, I think the drug manufacturers realize, and I do think that they have great intent to try to include the large, the population, especially a population as important as the Hispanic population, because this is something that's continuing to grow and will represent a larger portion of the patients that they're treating. So there has been more of an initiative, and obviously Dr. Rios mentioned the FDA initiative to have it mandatory that these studies be more diverse. And obviously these are steps in the positive direction. So clearly there's a momentum towards this, but I think that Hispanic and other minority physicians need to step up to the ball plate to actually do our share in terms of making this, increase in diversity in these clinical studies become a reality. You could give me the next slide, please. Now, first, let's take a look at some of the barriers that exist, because clearly these studies are not enrolling an adequate number of our patients. Okay, so if you take a look at these, at the chart there are a number of barriers listed, although it looks like they're all equal. They clearly are not. In my experience, the first two represent about 80% of the barriers, and the first one is obviously mistrust. And that comes from the fact of the historical nature of some of these studies, the fact that there's not enough clinical or cultural sensitivity or ability, and obviously a lack of awareness in terms of an environment where if your office does not create an environment where the patient feels comfortable and you ask them to participate within these studies, there's going to be a lack of comfort within the process. So obviously mistrust and lack of comfort are, to me, the biggest. The next biggest is at the bottom, and that is a lack of awareness of the fact that this is a possibility. So that in our office, frequently we'll see somebody that's not responding to medications that we have. And in that case, we are able to offer the patient a potential alternative. I mean, if we have a diabetic that's going blind and we've given them anti-veg medications, and they're not responding, then obviously the next step is to try to do one of these clinical trials. And have been very pleased with the results of these efforts, because another advantage that you have is that you can offer patients potentially the next generation of medications, the next an alternative avenue to treatment. So that's been a very important thing. Finally, the last two is a lack of information, and then finally a lack of time and resources. So in my experience, those are issues that are more easily overcome than the first two. Next slide. Now let me propose to you that Latinx physicians are uniquely positioned to address this problem. And that is one of the reasons why I would strongly encourage you, and I'll give you some of the other reasons as to why we should become more involved. The first one, obviously, is that it's something that's actually good for the community, it's good for the country, and it's good for your patients. Where, typically Hispanic physicians serve the communities. We frequently are within areas of large numbers of Hispanic patients, as well as other minorities. Typically, physicians from Hispanic backgrounds are culturally sensitive and competent. Frequently, we speak both English and Spanish, and if you're like me, you speak it together, sort of in a combination. The patients typically have trust because of that comfort, that when they see someone that looks like them and that can speak in the same language and can understand the cultural connotations of what you're offering them, they tend to have comfort and they tend to have trust. And obviously, we understand our patients' needs, which is the next one. And most physicians, or all physicians that I've actually known, truly have their patients' best interests at heart. And finally, the last thing is because we serve these communities, frequently we live within these communities, and we have family members of our family, that actually have these illnesses. So we have an interest in them. So these are some of the reasons why it's important for us to rise to the problem. But there's more to it than that. So let me have the next slide. Again, I think Latinx physicians can do a great deal to improve diversity within these studies. Okay, I would encourage you to actually take an interest or at least look into it. I can tell you a little bit about my own story. I mean, I was always interested in research and I pursued it, but until I got into it, I didn't recognize just how much it could enhance my practice, both in terms of what I offered and in terms of an economic nature. I mean, right now, I would say half of what my office produces comes from research, which also gives me the freedom to not be so dependent on managed care and so forth. So this is something that economically makes good sense, socially makes good sense, and morally makes good sense. I would encourage you to create a dedicated research team when you decide to get into these things, and then identify barriers that would keep you, not just you, but your patients from participating in them. And that is, the biggest thing for us was developing a cultural competence and in an environment where patients would come over and they would feel comfortable with what they were. And that's developing cultural competence not only in your own staff, but in referring physicians and the investigators and the study coordinators. And then obviously you have to acquire the necessary documents from the research groups to actually conduct these, because obviously almost all these clinical trials start out in English, but certainly in terms of my experience, as we started pushing more towards having it translated into Spanish, it has now become to the point where when people approach us, they already have it translated. Okay, so you have to ask for these things. If the study doesn't present it, then you need to talk to the sponsors to try to get that material, because that's a big part of making the patient comfortable, is not having to struggle to understand the material as to what they're going to be participating in. Okay, and then obviously we're developing a recruitment process. Okay, next slide, please. Now I had one slide here that unfortunately got lost. So I will tell you a little bit about that before I get into some pros. I will go ahead and tell you a little bit about the process of starting some of this. Again, making a commitment and deciding that you do want to become part of the research community is a big step. But once you take it, you're going to find that it's a very fruitful and very interesting process. The first thing to do, obviously, is when you set up your office, you've got to begin with setting up a good clinical coordinator, which is the core of all the clinical studies. And what we did, or what I typically do in my office, I find the most capable, most accurate, most reliable person, and I named them as top research coordinators. And for once you have this, you can build around this. And you can build around it by using initially back office staff to do part of the work. And then as you grow, you can continually add fully dedicated staff to do these clinical trials. Once you start on these, you can become very busy, and after a while, I mean, in my office, we have 6 people that do nothing but research. So you will grow into that, and then of course it almost self-runs itself. The last thing, of course, is that once you start getting into this, you want to dedicate a space, an area around your office where you actually can put people in, and where it's all dedicated towards nothing but research. I mean, once you do that, I think you'll find that the rest go. Finally, I would like to say that if you take a look at if you take a look at the equipment and stuff, and people think that, oh well, I don't want to spend that much money. In my experience, when you do a clinical study, if you don't have the equipment, don't be afraid to ask for it from the sponsors, because generally we have a lot of equipment in our office, but it's not unusual to have something that we don't have, and then we just ask the sponsor to go ahead and purchase it or rent it for us, and then it's not a barrier. Now, I would like to go ahead and leave you with some pearls, which I think you might want to keep in mind. Again, strongly encouraging physicians to participate in these studies, because it does improve not only the system, but your bottom line and your patients. So again, Latinx physicians are uniquely positioned to become involved in this, and so become a very important part of the process, okay? Often the sponsoring companies, and I mentioned this, do not start out aware of this, although they become much more aware in the recent years that these diverse patients exist in your office. So it's up to you to literally tell them. I mean, one of my first questions is always, well, do you have the consent in Spanish? And even if they say no, well, we're going to need that, then typically there's nothing else but to ask for it, and they'll usually give it to you. They're very good about that. The other thing that I have mentioned in the past to other audiences is the fact that one of the problems that we do have that's a barrier within our group is, of course, that there's a large number of Hispanics that are undocumented, that have a lot of these diseases and actually could benefit from this. Unfortunately, when they don't have a social security, it becomes a really difficult situation. But we take a look at, if you're able to keep the stipend below $600, which is your requirement to send a 1099, you can actually, try to avoid it. But it's a sticky situation, And it's something that over time we hope is going to get resolved because it does represent a significant barrier. And in my way of looking at it, it's highly discriminatory towards less fortunate people. I think to finalize this, again, you can do a lot of good. You can increase your bottom line, and you'll find that it'll add a lot of interest and a lot of richness to your life. So if anybody has a question later on, I will be more than happy to answer it. This is my last one, and this is our team, you can see. And that even includes the medical student in the middle, which we usually take medical students into a research section, and they find this also a very fruitful experience, and they work hard. You know, they can really help you do a lot of good stuff. So if you take a look at my team, there's virtually nobody on our team that doesn't speak at least 2 languages and doesn't know at least 2 cultures, you know. So in our community, the Slavic people have a high representation, so we hire a lot of Slavic people as well as Hispanics and naturally Asians. But I really make it a point that that's one of the big points of our clinical research program. Diversity in California, we have a lot of it, and we celebrate it in our office. And you know, we encourage people to exercise their culture, and that's helped us grow into one of the larger research groups in the area. So thank you so much, and I'll take questions later.
Thanks, Dr. Martel. I just want to remind everyone to put your questions for both of our speakers in the Q&A box so that we can I can read them to them. And our next speaker, glad to have you here, Dr. Edward Mena, who is the CEO of the California Liver Research Institute and the Pasadena Liver Center. And Ed, you can tell us more about your own lessons learned, and we look forward to it. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this talk. And it was a great presentation from Dr. Martel. What I'd like to kind of convey today is really the value of doing clinical research. And as Dr. Martel talked about earlier, if we don't get our own community engaged, then how are we going to learn about the disease process that's happening in our community? And for me, I have a very busy liver practice. I'm a hepatologist, so my area of interest is anything involving liver disease. And my clinical trial site is really focused on looking at liver disease in general, but also looking at how liver disease affects the Latino community. Next slide. I put this slide in because if you don't talk about cancer, you know, nobody pays attention. So I wanted to add this slide talking about how liver cancer affects the Latino community more than any other community. And why is that? Because the #1 cause of liver disease is not alcoholic fatty liver anymore. It's not hepatitis B and C anymore. The #1 cause of liver disease in the United States is fatty liver. And why is that? Because this is a component of the metabolic syndrome. Fatty liver is related to our weight, diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia. And what community does that affect the most? It affects our community. There is a genetic predisposition to this in the Latino community. We have a specific gene called PNPLA3 that for some reason we end up being homozygous of this disease, which means we progress onto cirrhosis faster and quicker than other ethnic groups. And if we don't have Latinos participating in clinical trials, like Dr. Martel said, you know, only 1% of Latino patients participated in this certain diabetes study. Well, guess what? If we only do not have enough patients participating in future drug therapy for fatty liver disease, how will we know it affects the Latino community? And I always give this example when I talk about clinical research. When I started my career at USC, and we were looking at hepatitis C. And at that time, hepatitis C was the #1 cause of cirrhosis and liver transplant. And we were doing a study wondering why Latino patients have more cirrhosis than other ethnic groups, in particular Caucasian and Asian patients. And at the time, and I'll never forget this, and this was in the late 1990s, early 2000, my attending said, well, it's obviously why, because Latino people drink more. And I was a little taken back from that. I was like, well, I don't think that's totally the case. The reason ended up being is because these patients had 2 hits to the liver. One was hepatitis C, one was fatty liver, and it was the combination of both that accelerated their progression onto cirrhosis. It wasn't because of that we drink more alcohol. We're pounding more tequila than anybody else. But that just kind of showed you the lack of sensitivity that people had in that era. And it's the fact that we just do not or did not have enough of our own community understanding and participating in clinical trials. Next slide. So I kind of want to go over the different phases of clinical trials, and it's important to understand, especially because we want to get not only more Latino physicians involved, more medical students involved in participating in clinical trials, but you kind of need to understand the different phases that are involved in drug development. Next slide. And what happens is first you get a drug that you're studying first in animal models. And then when you show maybe a little bit of safety in animal models and a little bit of efficacy, meaning, hey, this drug has a potential, then you move it on to the human phase of clinical trials. And phase 1, you're really studying it in a healthy group of patients. And basically you're looking for side effects. And you usually have a small group of patients, usually about 30 patients. And this is when you see the advertisement in college saying, hey, we'll pay you X amount of dollars for you to try this medication. And here we're looking at safety and tolerability. And that's usually phase 1. Next slide. Phase 2 is more that you're trying to do what's called a proof of concept. You want to see if this drug is going to work in the disease state that you want to study. So here you're looking at patients who have the disease. You're always still looking at safety. Safety is very important because when you do clinical trials, and Dr. Martel talked about this earlier, you have to have your infrastructure, meaning your research coordinators, and we are always looking at our patients like hawks. If they sneeze, we want to know, is that a side effect of the medication? So phase 2, we're looking at safety and efficacy, of course, but it's really a proof of concept. Is the drug working and safe on humans? Then next slide, you go on phase 3. And phase 3, you study in a larger group of participants who have the disease. And here you're really looking to see, is the drug working? And here's where you look to see, if you remember all your stats that you may or may not love in college, looking for the data, looking at see if it's statistically significant. And yes, you always should compare it with the placebo arm. And usually, depending on how the study is designed, is 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. But you always have to have a placebo arm because that's how you know that, or you can compare it using a statistical analysis if the drug is really working. Also, patients are always double-blinded, meaning the patient doesn't know what medication they're getting, and me as a principal investigator don't know what medication is they're getting. That way we don't fudge the data and the data comes out clean and pure, and we're able to do a proper statistical analysis on it. Next slide. So then the drug gets FDA approved after your phase 3 trials, and you get what's called NDA, which is a new drug application, and hopefully the drug may or may not get approved, depending on if you're showing that it was statistically significant and making sure that the risks don't outweigh the benefits, that the drug doesn't have too many side effects, and you're able to move forward. Next slide. Phase 4 studies, I really enjoy doing phase 4 studies because here we're looking at the efficacy. Because as Dr. Martel spoke earlier, when you do a clinical trial, you have what's called an inclusion and an exclusion criteria. And usually we always look for the best good-looking patients to enroll in clinical trials. But in the real world, it's sometimes not always like that. And what a phase 4 study does is we want to show that the real world experience matches that of their clinical trial. And I think a perfect example of that was our hepatitis C medications. When we did the clinical trials for hepatitis C, we wanted to make sure it's 8 weeks enough, 12 weeks enough, and was it having a cure rate of 98%. And when we did the phase 4 real world studies, it exactly matched exactly like it did in the clinical trials. You had a cure rate of 98%. So it's telling you that the way that the clinical trials were designed matched what it was in the real world. Why is that important for our community? As Dr. Martel said earlier, different ethnicities metabolize drugs differently. And if we don't have enough Latino patients in our clinical trials, it's going to make it very difficult to say, hey, does this drug work? Yes or no. A good example using ethnic populations is one of the drugs that was developed for liver cancer. This drug was called sorafenib. And when they studied it in America first in a mostly Caucasian population. And the drug worked pretty good on Caucasian patients at the doses that they gave. But when they did the studies in Asia, looking at Asian patients using this drug on liver cancer, it had a horrible effect because the drug was metabolized differently in Asians than it was in the Caucasian community. And what they found is that the Asian SHARP study, which is what it's called, did not work because it wasn't studied well and the dose was totally different than it has to be in Asian patients than Caucasian patients, which is very true in the Latino population. And if we're looking at a disease state, such as the one that I'm interested in, fatty liver, if we're not studying it enough in our Latino population, we're actually having a disservice to our patients because we truly don't know if the drug works or not. And one of the challenges I give you and the residents and the fellows is when you look at papers, and the first thing you look at or should look at is the demographic page on that paper. And that demographic page should represent your patient population that you're treating in your clinics. And if it's not, then you have to kind of maybe challenge the study a little bit. If it's only 90% Caucasian patients, then how do you really know it's going to work in the Latino community? Next slide. So when you want to build an infrastructure, and Dr. Martel kind of touched on this a little bit, I think the key thing is, what disease state do you want to study? Is it diabetes? Is it hypertension? For me, it's liver disease, in particular fatty liver, because right now there's 80 million Americans who have fatty liver disease because of the obesity epidemic, diabetes epidemic. So, and our community suffers the most from it. And then when you do clinical trials, what phase of those studies, 1, 2, 3, or even 4, do you want to focus on? Maybe mostly 2 and 3. I like to do studies that are a long time, meaning a year to 5 years. I don't really like the short 12-week studies. So you need to find out what you're interested in. And then you need to have, like Dr. Martel said, you need to have a great research coordinator, a great research assistant, but most importantly, the #1 person on your team, and I remember when Dr. Martel spoke about this at our meeting, is your budget coordinator. Whether you want to act as your budget coordinator, I have a phenomenal budget coordinator. She looks at everything like a hawk to make sure that we are getting reimbursed for everything that we're doing, because you want to make sure your finances and what you're billing, what you do, or you're actually billing for correctly. And then you need to determine what type of organization you want to have. Like our organization here is a nonprofit 501c3. If you want to make it a for-profit LLC, that's okay, but then you have to worry about taxes. So you need to determine what type of infrastructure. And then remember, every study needs to go through what's called an IRB, an institutional review board. Some people have a central, some people have a local. For example, if I was on the main campus at USC, then we have to go through the USC IRB. Because I am on my own and have my own 501c3, we use a central IRB. Central IRBs, like it kind of implies, it's throughout the United States. And there's four or five right now, central IRBs that everybody uses. And the great thing, if Pfizer already has it approved by a central IRB, it's easier to get it approved in your site. And one of the successes that we have, let's say over academic medical centers, is that we get studies approved faster and quicker. Why? Because it's me and my budget coordinator doing the budget, so we can get the budget approved in 2 to 3 weeks. We have a central IRB, we can get that approved in 2 to 3 weeks. So when we get presented a clinical trial, we can get it up and running in about 6 to 8, 12 weeks, depending on how quickly the company wants to get it done. Next slide. I think the most important thing about getting your research center up and running is who your networks are. And number one, I think joining a consortium. So we have a fatty liver consortium where we meet with other hepatologists and say, hey, I got this study. Hey, are you interested in doing this study? And we all collaborate together. One of the great things about here is that the National Hispanic Health Foundation has a collaboration for you to network and get involved in clinical trials. I can't state the importance of knowing who your pharmaceutical companies are, what drugs they have in the pipeline in development, and speaking with the medical science liaison, because that individual can get you connected to the type of studies that you want to do. But I think the key thing is, what type of practice do you want to have? What type of clinical trials do you want to have? Are you getting most of your patients from your own personal clinic, which is what I personally do? Or is it a group or hospital practice that you're getting your patients from? And marketing to different centers to get these patients into your clinical trials is imperative. And some of the barriers that I have is that I will present a clinical trial to one of my patients, and the first thing they say was, well, you know, I love my primary care doctor, and I'm going to put Dr. Preciado on the spot because she's downstairs on the second floor. You know, I have to talk to Dr. Preciado before I enroll in your clinical trial, Dr. Mena. And usually Dr. Preciado says, yes, of course, anything Dr. Mena wants, he's great. But if the primary care provider doesn't understand or believe in clinical trials and says, nope, you shouldn't be a guinea pig on this study, don't enroll. That sometimes could be a barrier. So I think one of the important things that not only do we have to have Latinos in clinical trials, but we have to have our Latino practitioners understanding what clinical trials do, understanding the safety involved in these clinical trials, because that's what we're looking for, and understanding the need to get our own community involved in clinical trials. Next slide. So what are the things that I think are important to me, and Dr. Martel mentioned this earlier, is most of the patients I get is from my own personal clinic. So there is a trust factor there. They understand, they've been with me for a long time. They are okay with undergoing a clinical trial, and they understand that these clinical trials are highly regulated. We look at every single side effect. And we got to lose this stigma, this fear of enrolling into clinical trials, this guinea pig scenario. We are looking at side effects, but our patients are closely watched, and we're looking at safety and efficacy. And it's important to study this in our group. And I gave you the example of Hep C earlier. Another example of a disease state that we have in liver disease is called primary biliary cholangitis. And if you Google that right now, it's going to say, of the people who have PBC, 90% are Caucasian women. We prove that that is incorrect, and we're about to write this paper now, that 50% of the patients with PBC are actually Latina women. But where did that statistic come from? It came from academic centers and Caucasian physicians studying the patients that are in their database. And if you're Caucasian, the majority of patients are going to be white. And therefore, you're going to say, yeah, 90% of these patients who have this disease are white women, because that's all you have in your database. And we prove that to be wrong. But unless we start getting more of our patients involved in clinical trials, more of our providers involved in clinical trials, that's the only way to change some of these barriers and stigmas. And I'm also going to mention real quick about writing papers. I'm not the best paper writer ever. So to think that I'm a good paper writer, I'm going to tell you you're wrong. But all the publications that I'm involved in is I always have help, meaning that either the pharmaceutical company is writing the paper, but my name is on it because we were the highest enroller, or they actually help you provide medical writers to help you write the paper. So never feel free because you fear that you can't write a paper because you may not have that skill set. I'm going to tell you, I don't have that skill set. I'm not very good at it, but I'm able to get support and help to do that. Next slide. Oh, real quick though. Next slide real quick. So also the other thing that's very important about clinical trials, it's free. There's no cost to the patient. Don't care what their insurance plan, don't care what HMO. I don't have to write a referral to get patients into clinical trials. In fact, we usually give them a few bucks for participating in clinical trials. And sometimes one of the barriers I've had is transportation. We will work on getting the patient transportation, whether it's Uber, Lyft, even a rideshare program that we have. We work on transportation, getting them to whatever appointments they need to do for the clinical trials or coming to us. Next slide. So how did I get involved? Well, I've kind of done clinical trials I've done research all my life since I was at college at UCLA in the early 90s. And it's something, like Dr. Martel said, I really, really loved. One of the things I think we need to do better in our Latino communities is physicians and peers doing clinical trials. I always want to get our younger residents, especially our Latino residents, involved in clinical trials. And one of the fears they always said is that, Dr. Man, I just don't really want to write papers. Well, you don't have to write papers. What you need to be doing is understanding clinical trials, getting your patients involved in clinical trials, and you participating as a principal investigator, a sub-I, a sub-principal investigator. That way you learn drug development, because if we're not involved in drug development, guess what? We're going to be left out of the conversation. And we don't want to be left out of the conversation because we're the largest ethnic group growing in the United States, and we need to be front and center in this conversation. So we need better physician to peers networking. We need to build these network and consortiums among our groups so we can all communicate and speak with each other. Hey, what is it that made you successful? Hey, Ed, what are you doing that you are the highest enroller in this clinical trial? Mentoring and having this discussion is the way to go, but we need to expand to younger physicians. And if there's one thing that we need to do, I think, a little better, is get these students not only involved from the residency point of view, but medical school point of view. But I think we got to start getting these kids in high school and having them either follow me around, follow Dr. Martel around, and understanding what research is. Because when people think about research, they think, oh, you know, you have to be a professor at the USCs, UCLAs, at the Harvards of the world. Well, you know what? My dad wasn't a professor. But, you know, I'd be happy to mentor some of the younger kids in high school on clinical trials. Next slide. Pharma. And so I put this slide in because some of the younger generation thinks pharma is bad, because they all kind of think, hey, this is what's driving the cost of medicine and the cost of pharmaceuticals. And yes, that is one point of view. But I think here we need to partner with pharma, not only to get donations in our 501c3s, but to help us build a non-academic research center, to build an infrastructure that will help us do research and get our patients into clinical trials. And like Dr. Martel said, you know, when you do clinical trials, if you don't have a -70 freezer, they will give you one. If you don't have a centrifuge, they will give you one. They will give you the proper equipment to conduct clinical trials. So I would look at pharma as more of a partnership rather than being antagonistic with pharma. Pharma, I think, is our friend, and it's not about selling the drug. It's about learning how this drug works, and especially how it works in Latino patients. Next slide. These are just some of the studies that we have in our clinical trial center, and it involves Gilead, some of the big pharmas and small pharmas, but I like to do the phase 2 and 3. I don't really like to do phase 1 very much. But again, this is where my area of interest lies. So when you want to start studies or you want to start a clinical trial center, you got to figure out what is your passion and where you see how you want to build your infrastructure to the type of studies that you want to do. Next slide. Through all this, I developed an app. You can get this app right now. It's called Research Hound. And what we're trying to do is connect patients to clinical trials in an easy way that we can build relationships with patients. We can build relationships with research centers, primary care doctor's office to get patients into clinical trials. Next slide. And I think that's my last slide. And I think my take-home message is partner with pharma. Partner with your colleagues. Let's have better mentoring programs, and do not be afraid of doing clinical trials. And I'll end it there. And I think we're going to do some Q&A.
Yeah, we have a few questions that I want to go ahead and ask both of our speakers. I don't have access to the chat box. Letty, I sent you a message. If you can let everybody know our website address. But I want to let everyone know now to, if anybody has a question, put it into the Q&A box. I'm reading them from there. And I put a few questions together. Let me ask Joe, let me start with you. I think some of the process questions on how to start. What was the biggest challenge when you started? You know, you did mention the importance, both of you mentioned the importance of the type of staff to have, but what was the biggest challenge? And one person asked, one of the doctors asked, what was the transition? How did you make the transition from just seeing patients to changing to, you said right now you're almost 50% of clinical trials in your practice and 50% seeing patients, but how did you start? How did you get to that? You know, how'd you say, okay, let me spend 25% of my time just getting ready to do clinical trials?
Well, I think for me, it was the hardest part is deciding that you're going to make a commitment. So it's almost like a marriage. You decide, okay, this is something that I'm going to do, and I'm going to do what it takes. And the big advice that I would give to anybody interested is go ahead and run a good clinical practice or GCP training program, which you can get free from NIH or a number of other sites. And that itself will give you the exact process of what's involved in great detail, and actually put you through a little bit of a test, which shows, that'll give you the background. Once you get that done, then the next step is, if you're real lazy, you can just go ahead and hire somebody to come into your office. And there are actually people that'll come in that work with the National Hispanic Medical that'll actually come in and turnkey, will actually just start it all for you. And I would say that's making the big commitment. And the last big factor was when I decided to make a big commitment, I had to recognize that it was a process requiring a team. Okay, medicine is built on the team concept, and nothing is more important than the team concept within research. Because if you have the right people around you, you're going to be a great success. And the greater the success you are, the greater people will seek you out. And when you first start out looking for the first research trial that you want to go into, what I did was very simple. I looked at all the medications that I was using, and I looked at which companies I was using them from, and then I approached them. And lo and behold, there was a great interest in terms of getting me started. And they actually sent people out to talk to me. They sent the team. They started to let me know what condition my situation was. And that, once you get into it, then the process, it just starts moving forward. The other thing is your colleagues. I mean, people, like Dr. Mena or myself, if you have any questions, feel free to call. I think you're going to find that it's a warm community that wants people to get into the research environment. And so, the whole environment is designed to make you succeed in that. So I would say start out with good clinical practice program, and it's free. A couple of hours, you can get an enormous amount of information from that.
Okay, and we'll find out if anyone has resources. We'd be happy to collect them, and I know that I'll talk a little bit more about what we're planning to do. A question for you, Ed. Considering the shortage of Latino doctors in the country, one of our doctors asked, why wouldn't we be focused on the non-Hispanic doctor, who's obviously they're seeing a lot of Latino patients too? How would you go about including non-Hispanic doctor in clinical trials with what we're trying to do here with NHHF?
So I think the more education on anybody is great. But remember too, though, when we sign a consent for patients, meaning you're consenting them into clinical trials, it should be done in the language that they speak. And either you have a coordinator who's fluent in Spanish and can go through the consent and the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the patients, but we need to have some representation in those clinical trial centers of the demographic of the patients that you're representing. So if the physician is Caucasian, that's fine. I don't have an issue with that, but they need to have some type of coordinator that would speak the language of that's native to the community. For example, we do a lot of Hep B clinical trials, and hepatitis B is mostly affecting the Asian community. Obviously, I am not Asian, but we have a research coordinator that's Asian, speaks fluent Mandarin, and can communicate the consent and all the processes that are involved in the clinical trial to them.
Great. Let me ask you another question, because you mentioned it, I think, more than Joe did, was about the budget. So how did you get your first grant? Or let me put it this way. Did you have to write a proposal to get the funding to start your clinical trial? And if not, how did you get the money to start the clinical trial and hire the staff and the computers and everything else you needed for that clinical trial?
So we did not write a grant. We were all pro forma, meaning that we would enroll into clinical trials that you would have to present a budget. And if I had to give one area of advice or one area of mentorship, is the budget. And you do get fees, meaning a startup fee of X amount of dollars, physical exam fees, X amount of dollars. That kind of took a little bit of experience. I've been doing this for about 7 years, and I got to say the first 2 years, we may have not have done a good job, but it's managing your budget and to make sure you're making a profit and not losing money is how we did it. We did not start off with grants or NIH grants, because those are hard to do. We really started it with upfront cash from pharma at our clinical trials.
And was that I'm assuming you had an agreement that said you would deliver so many patients, or can you just talk about the specifics on how you got that funding?
Yeah, so before every clinical trial, they kind of they do what's called a feasibility in your center. How many patients can you screen? How many patients do you think you can enroll either per month, per every 6 months, per year? And it's not that hard. You just kind of look at what your patient base is. And then typically I always say I can enroll 5 patients in a clinical trial, but to enroll for us in fatty liver 5 patients, you have to screen about 20 patients. So that scenario is how they determine, number one, are you going to be a good site? Number two, are you going to enroll the proper patients? Because they also don't want you to screen 60 patients and then only enroll 1. So the companies are looking for a feasibility of how good you're able to look through your own personal database to get patients in clinical trials.
Okay, great. Joe, someone asked, what was the liability insurance that you had to get, or liability issues to do clinical trials in your office?
Well, we have never had anything other than the malpractice, and obviously standard liability for the practice. But you know, one of the things that we do is, for us, it's a little bit easier because the medications we're using do not have the potential toxicity as say Dr. Menas is going to have, where he might be looking at an oncology medication or something that actually can have more serious. Mm-hmm. So for us, I mean, what we're dealing with, yes, we can have some pretty hardcore medication, but it's a lot easier for us to pull patients in and out without having long toxic areas. So our liability has never really been an issue. I mean, that certainly is something that you have to take a look at carefully, but typically our malpractice is what has covered that. And typically the contract that you sign with a person that's running the study will typically include some language in the contract in terms of the liability and how it's divvied out. That is along with a budget, and I think Dr. Mena's got it right on there. I mean, yes, you're doing this for a good moral purpose and you're doing it to improve the system, but you also have to make sure that you're liquid. And negotiating contracts is something that it can seem a little bit uncomfortable at the beginning, but if you do it right and you see that you're actually being profitable, you're willing to take that discomfort, and after a while it just becomes natural. I mean, you know, people kind of know roughly what you're going to be requiring, and when they offer you something, they're almost coming in at what you require. But these are really important factors. But the liability for us has not really been a significant issue. And we pay very much, a lot of attention to that, and it obviously varies. If I'm looking at, say, for us, an artificial tear, well, the chances of liability and that is going to be very minimal. Whereas I'm taking a look at an intraocular procedure, then of course the liability becomes much, much greater. So you have to take a look at the studies and make sure that that everything is proper in terms of protecting yourself and your practice. And if not, then you don't take the study.
Mhm. Okay, well, I'm going to have to stop there. We have a lot of a few announcements to make. Lethea, can you put the next slides? First of all, let me thank you very much and thank everybody that was on this call today. And I do want to make a couple announcements. The slides and the survey, we're going to send a survey to everyone that registered to get your information, and also whether you're interested more in helping us be a mentor, have experience with clinical trials, or if you're interested in actually learning about clinical trials and being what we consider a mentee. And our website is NHMA-Foundation.org/national-center-4-Hispanic-health.research. It's a long one. But anyway, if you go to our NHHF website, we have a page now on the National Center for Hispanic Health Research. And we are going to have this presentation recorded and the slides that will be there next week. I also want to mention, I did thank all our partners, especially Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, but there is another partner that we're working with right now called Care Access. And I just want to mention Care Access is a company that helps and enables physicians to go into clinical trials who are in private practice. And it was one of the companies that Ed and Joe both mentioned, the type of company that is needed to help you with understanding the business side of clinical trials. And we're going to find out more about Care Access later, I think in another webinar or even at our conference. But I'm really interested in letting people know, and if you have resources, if you started your own clinical trials, to let us know how you did that so that we can share them with everyone through this website. We are also, like I mentioned, looking for people that want to get involved, and just send your name to NHHF@NHMAFoundation.org. I already told you about the questionnaire we're going to send out. And we also have our scholarship programs. Every year, NHHF provides scholarships. This year, we're going to provide about 40 scholarships to students that are in health profession schools who are committed to serving the Latino community in their future. These are outstanding academic students. We fly in the students and the parents to either California or New York. And the California event is November 17th. The New York event is December 1st. If you're interested at all in helping us with sponsorship or donations so that we can bring all these students together, we have a deadline for the invitation to put your name in as a host committee member or as a sponsor of September 23rd. And I just want to say that we're really excited about the opportunity to promote the scholarships to the students. We also have a community access grant. This was through the Rockefeller Foundation, deadline September 4th. Now, this is only for 3 cities in the country that had very high COVID-19 rates: Houston, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, and Oakland, California. But we are giving funding to community-based organizations and to check out our Rockefeller Solo Kiko COVID-19 program site. Again, if you go to the NHHF website, NHMAFoundation.org, and look under programs, you will see this. And of course, any questions, you can send it to Letty, who's our program manager at NHHF, at NHHF@NHMAFoundation.org. So I want to thank our speakers again, Ed and Joe. Thank you very much for all of your career in research And I just want to say that we have a research network, both at NHMA and NHHF, but we're going to consolidate the researchers that want to do clinical trials into the NHHF program. We've had, so just to answer one question that somebody had about other research opportunities, we do have research speakers at our national conference of NHMA, which will be next year, April 27th through the 30th in Chicago. And we're looking for more speakers now. We'd like to be able to build this clinical trials project to have another session at next year's conference. And Joe and Ed, you're welcome to come back, but also maybe find others that can help be resources there for the people who come. So thank you very much. And thank you, Letty, again. And we'll have this recording and the slides up next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellen.